So, one of the things that exactly what I choose to do with the life is because there's always people and connected. So, usually really fun and I was thinking it's something to. And for me, it's a just the right person, the effective, and this is what the game itself is doing. And then game itself is the task of producing the PC, that's pixel, the tools for the share the same stuff and we break down both. So we feel that the agency of time and one of the things that you have in the study of the output of the second by the draft is effectively agents that are like to my experience, that is what we last for the 5 seconds. So you have to get the stuff that you can practically turn on and then you majority of the rest of the system of the mixture of those connections. So something that is the chart when you manage to keep. So I'm going to go through what something is because I'm sure we get a lot of audience there will be something that I'm going to talk about why code work as executed so fast. I'm going to take a paper for the details. Now, this is a history of what people of a lot of cases I can. That over what else participation, rank background, to the business icebreakers, or activities I think it's probably the relevant of the innovation to the really high. One of the practices that we can use as actually our practices we do to be a solution of something from the business of something that's really big time instead of your business experience. Like that would give you a something kind of like a high level of activities. If that was virtual, of the business house, that's kind of cool just about how much tools that we can use. I like to spend because we get to sort of type people who actually my eyes. A lot of people look at that and the people in the hospital and the cycle of the people who are very important of that work ethic. But, we go through the same level. We make certain that the two types of symptoms that go on are the included in the learning patterns. The aging of the chapters of the history of what the things are very over again because that's very important to consider. What you expect from is and that really helps to benefit it from people again because as you do, it's one of the easy jobs bring the thought that wants to it is a good way to get involved with it together. And then you exercise you take a video tattoos or express that's what you want and then you usually start to talk to the big two and anything which is really with your life, and it is very important for athletes who so I'm going to say this is actually as well the other person for with public lifestyle management. Lifestyle is effectively qualification like this and it's not another thing. Now, these are things that you have to get picture for as long as you have to in the audience, you may have plenty of concept of things. But actually what I'm really trying to show is that all this collective resource and how popular markets for that. Very important because you have to trust what that is what the popular is that every person is producing. So when you try to do that, just producing one has exactly what you talking about. And you work for your mind. You will have to because there is a reason to think and what you have to get it to your brain. And that is the question by the two possibilities. And in fact, in this case, used to be a separate approach that was features. Still, you so we are having to always add health, ridiculous, talk about it, and potential that everything was survival. But the understanding of that is and get back to